Some people carry scars where the world can see them. Others hide them behind a perfectly tailored suit. The rain had been falling over Manhattan since late afternoon, turning the sidewalks into rivers of reflected city lights and washing the usual Friday noise into something softer, almost forgiving. I watched droplets race down the restaurant window as I stirred a cup of coffee that had gone cold nearly 20 minutes earlier. I wasn't waiting for anyone. At least that's what every newspaper in New York would have believed if they'd seen me sitting there alone. Ethan Moretti never waited. Ethan Moretti made other people wait. At 36 years old, I'd built an empire powerful enough that senators returned my calls before breakfast and CEOs changed their schedules when my assistant sent a single text. Yet none of that mattered when the chair across from me stayed empty for another Friday night. Marco, the owner of the little Italian restaurant on Lexington Avenue, understood the arrangement without asking questions. Every Friday, he reserved the same corner table, same espresso, same grilled salmon, same silence. His staff knew better than to interrupt unless necessary. Outside, umbrellas drifted past the windows like colorful ghosts while couples hurried through the storm laughing beneath shared jackets. Families squeezed together under awnings. Children jumped over puddles as if rain had been invented purely for their entertainment. I found myself watching them longer than I should have. Maybe because they reminded me that somewhere beyond boardrooms and security convoys, ordinary life continued without asking permission from people like me. My bodyguards remained near the entrance, pretending not to watch me while watching everyone else. They had perfected the art years ago. To everyone inside the restaurant, they probably looked like businessmen finishing dinner. They weren't. Every pair of eyes that entered the room was measured. Every hand reaching into a pocket was noticed. Every unfamiliar face became another calculation. That was the price of surviving in my world. I reached for my coffee again when I noticed a tiny pair of yellow rain boots standing beside my table. At first I only saw the boots, decorated with little white daisies splashed across the rubber. Then my eyes traveled upward to a blue raincoat several sizes too big, damp blonde curls peeking from beneath a hood, and finally bright green eyes studying me with fearless curiosity. She couldn't have been older than 6. Most adults avoided looking directly at me. This little girl didn't seem to understand why anyone would. She simply smiled with the uncomplicated confidence only children possess. She shifted a small stuffed bunny from one arm to the other before speaking in the sweetest voice I'd heard in years. "Sir, can I sit here with you?" The entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. I noticed Marco freeze behind the register. One of my security men straightened almost imperceptibly near the entrance. A waitress carrying 2 bowls of pasta slowed her steps. No one approached. No one dared. The little girl, however, seemed completely unaware that she'd just asked the most feared man in the city a question nobody else would have considered asking. She wasn't scared. She wasn't impressed. She simply looked at the empty chair across from me as though it was the most natural seat in the world. Before I could answer, she added quietly, "My mommy says people shouldn't eat alone when they're sad." I forgot about the rain. I forgot about the coffee growing colder by the second. And for the first time in more years than I cared to count, I realized a stranger had looked directly into my eyes and somehow seen the loneliness I'd spent an entire lifetime hiding. For several long seconds, I simply looked at her, unable to remember the last time anyone had spoken to me without caution or calculation. Her tiny fingers still rested on the back of the empty chair, waiting patiently instead of assuming the answer. She was wearing a blue raincoat dotted with tiny silver stars, and the sleeves covered half of her hands every time she moved. Water dripped from the hem onto the polished hardwood floor, forming a little puddle beneath her yellow boots. I found myself nodding before my mind caught up with the decision. "You may." Her smile arrived. Instantly, bright enough to make the gray evening outside seem less heavy. She climbed into the chair with surprising determination, carefully placing her stuffed bunny beside her plate as though introducing an old friend to dinner. "Thank you, sir," she said politely. "Mommy says good manners make people feel safe." Safe. The word echoed somewhere deep inside me. I could not remember the last time anyone had associated my presence with safety. Around us, conversations slowly resumed, although quieter than before. My security team relaxed only slightly, exchanging uncertain glances. They had prepared for threats countless times. None of them had ever trained for a 6-year-old carrying a worn stuffed rabbit. The waitress approached cautiously with a children's menu, but the little girl shook her head. I already ate grilled cheese with Mommy. I only wanted to sit for a minute. Then she turned those bright green eyes back toward me as if we had known each other for years. You looked lonely through the window. I almost laughed, except the sound would have felt unfamiliar. Did I? She nodded with complete confidence. People who stare at rain for a long time are usually thinking about someone they miss. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup. She had guessed something no business rival, politician, or investigator ever had. Before I could answer, she reached into the pocket of her raincoat and pulled out a white paper napkin she had folded into careful little shapes. Tiny wings, a round head, a crooked halo drawn with a blue crayon. It was an angel, imperfect but unmistakable. I make these when somebody is sad, she explained. Mommy taught me. She gently placed the little paper angel beside my untouched coffee. My heartbeat slowed, then stumbled. Years disappeared without warning. Another rainy evening. Another restaurant. Another tiny pair of hands folding napkins across the table while giggling because every angel came out lopsided. My daughter used to wrinkle her nose every time the wings refused to stay even. She would hold each one up proudly anyway and tell me that real angels did not need perfect wings because they already knew how to fly. I had not thought about that memory in years. Maybe I had refused to. The paper angel resting beside my cup looked almost identical to the last one she ever folded for me. I reached toward it with hands that suddenly felt much older than 36. My fingertips barely touched the delicate paper before they started to tremble. Across the dining room, Marco quietly lowered his eyes, pretending not to notice. My security detail became perfectly still. The little girl smiled as if she had accomplished something important without realizing what it truly meant. There, she whispered softly. Now you do not have to eat alone anymore. My throat tightened before I understood why. It was not because of the paper angel itself. It was because of the way she had set it beside my coffee with both hands, carefully, almost reverently, exactly as another little girl had done years before. I stared at the uneven folds until the edges blurred. The restaurant faded into silence around me. The rain against the windows became distant, like a memory echoing through another lifetime. I could almost hear a tiny voice laughing as she complained that one wing was always bigger than the other. My daughter had never cared. She used to tell me that perfect things belonged in museums, not in people's hearts. I had forgotten those words. Or maybe I had buried them somewhere too painful to visit. My fingers closed gently around the fragile paper, afraid that even the slightest pressure would destroy it. The little girl watched me with innocent curiosity. She was waiting for me to smile, not realizing she had just unlocked a room inside my soul that I had kept sealed for years. Something warm touched my cheek. At first I thought it was rain from the window somehow reaching me. Then another drop followed. I slowly lifted my hand and realized it was a tear. One tear. Then another. I had faced impossible negotiations without blinking. I had attended funerals wearing the same calm expression I wore in board meetings. I had trained myself to believe that tears solved nothing. Yet a 6-year-old stranger with a folded napkin had quietly undone everything I thought I had mastered. Across the restaurant, Marco removed his glasses and pretended to polish them for far longer than necessary. He had known me for almost 15 years. He had never once seen me cry. Near the entrance, my head of security, Daniel, instinctively took one step forward before stopping himself. His eyes met mine for only a second before he respectfully looked away. Every member of my team suddenly found something else to examine. A framed painting, the dessert display, the rain outside. They understood without a single word that this moment belonged to me alone. The little girl tilted her head. "Did I make you sad?" she asked quietly. I shook my head, unable to trust my voice. After a long breath, I finally managed to answer. "No." My voice sounded rough, unfamiliar. "You reminded me of someone very special." She smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a child who believed she had helped. "Then she must have been really nice." I laughed softly through the tears, surprising even myself. She was. The little girl reached across the table and gently patted the back of my hand. Not because she understood my history. Not because she knew my name or my reputation. She simply believed that lonely people deserve kindness. That simple belief carried more strength than every ounce of influence I had accumulated over decades. Just then the front door opened, letting in another gust of cool rain-scented air. I heard hurried footsteps crossing the entrance, followed by a woman's anxious voice asking the hostess if she had seen a little blonde girl wearing yellow rain boots. The child beside me looked toward the sound and whispered, "That is my mommy." Before I could turn, I noticed the concern in the woman's voice, the exhaustion beneath it, and the quiet determination that only someone protecting a child every single day could carry. Something told me this rainy evening was not ending with a paper angel. It was only introducing me to the family that was about to change everything I believed about my own life. I turned toward the entrance just as she appeared, slightly out of breath, rainwater clinging to the loose strands of chestnut hair that had escaped her ponytail. She could not have been older than 29. Her beige coat was inexpensive but carefully maintained, the sleeves damp from the storm, and she carried herself with the quiet determination of someone who had learned to solve every problem without expecting help from anyone else. Her blue eyes swept across the dining room until they found the little girl sitting across from me. Relief softened every line of her face. "Lily." She hurried toward our table, kneeling beside the child before wrapping both arms around her in a gentle embrace. "Sweetheart, I told you not to wander off. I was so worried." Lily hugged her back immediately. "I am sorry, Mommy." But he looked lonely. The woman followed Lily's gaze toward me for the first time. The relief on her face instantly transformed into embarrassment. "Oh my goodness." She stood quickly, brushing invisible wrinkles from her coat. "I am so sorry, sir. I hope she was not bothering you. She talks to everyone. I keep telling her that not every stranger wants company." I looked at Lily, who still sat proudly beside the little paper angel. She was not bothering me. My voice sounded calmer than it had in years. She was exactly where she needed to be. The woman blinked, clearly surprised by my answer. "Still, I apologize. She has the biggest heart of anyone I have ever known." Lily reached for the stuffed bunny and smiled. "See? I told you he needed a friend." The woman sighed with affectionate defeat before turning back to me. "Thank you for being kind to her." She extended her hand politely. "My name is Grace Carter." I looked at her offered hand for a brief moment before accepting it. Her grip was warm despite the rain, steady despite her obvious exhaustion. Most people hesitated when they shook my hand, intimidated by rumors or reputation long before meeting me. Grace did neither. She simply introduced herself to another human being. "Ethan," I replied. "Nothing more. No last name. No title." She smiled politely, unaware that half the city would have recognized the surname I deliberately left unspoken. "It is nice to meet you, Ethan." Those simple words landed differently than they should have. There was no admiration in her voice. No fear. No expectation. Only kindness. Lily tugged gently on Grace's sleeve. "Mommy, I gave him an angel because he misses somebody." Grace looked at the folded napkin resting beside my coffee and then back at me. For just a second, her expression changed. Not curiosity, recognition. She knew grief when she saw it. She did not ask questions. She did not offer sympathy. Instead, she gave me the smallest nod, the kind exchange between two strangers carrying invisible burdens. "Sometimes children notice things adults spend years trying to hide," she said softly. I found myself unable to disagree. Marco quietly approached with a small paper bag. "Miss Carter," he said warmly, "your soup order is ready." Grace smiled with grateful surprise. "Thank you." I was going to pick it up before Lily disappeared. She reached into her purse, searching for her wallet, but Marco gently raised one hand. "It has already been taken care of." Confusion crossed her face. "That cannot be right." Marco glanced briefly toward me before smiling politely. "Tonight it is our pleasure." Grace looked between us, clearly uncomfortable accepting generosity from strangers. "I appreciate it, but I really should pay." Before I could answer, Lily slipped her tiny hand into Grace's and whispered, "Mommy, sometimes people just want to help." Grace looked down at her daughter, then back at me. For the first time that evening, our eyes met without words. Something quiet passed between us, something neither money nor influence could purchase. And as they prepared to leave, I realized I was no longer watching the rain outside the window. I was watching the two people walking toward it, with a feeling I had almost forgotten existed. Hope. They disappeared into the rain beneath a shared umbrella, Lily talking with animated excitement, while Grace listened with the patient smile only a devoted parent could wear after a long day. I remained seated long after they had vanished beyond the fogged restaurant windows. My coffee was cold. My dinner had barely been touched. Yet for the first time in years, I did not feel the familiar emptiness waiting for me at the end of the evening. Daniel approached my table, only after several quiet minutes. He had worked beside me for more than a decade and understood the difference between silence that needed protection and silence that needed respect. "The car is ready whenever you are," he said. I nodded without standing. "Find out where Grace Carter works." Daniel hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Is there a problem?" "No." I looked down at the paper angel still resting beside my cup. "I only want to make sure life is being kind to them." He accepted the answer without another question. By the following afternoon, a slim folder rested on my desk. I opened it expecting little more than an address and a job title. Instead, I found a story hidden inside ordinary facts. Grace Carter, 29 years old, third-grade teacher at a public elementary school in Queens. No criminal record, no financial scandals. Annual salary that barely covered rent, groceries, and childcare. She volunteered every Saturday at the community library reading books to children whose parents worked weekends. Lily Carter, 6 years old, adopted 3 years earlier after spending nearly a year in the foster care system. Grace had never married. She had chosen to become a mother because one little girl needed someone who would never stop coming back for her. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. Some people spent fortunes trying to impress the world. Grace had quietly changed one child's entire future without asking anyone to notice. I found myself thinking about the soup she had insisted on paying for, about the careful way she folded her coat before sitting down, about the tired circles beneath her eyes that no amount of determination could completely hide. She reminded me of people I used to know before success became measured in buildings instead of kindness. The following Monday, Daniel placed another report on my desk. "The school roof has been leaking for months," he explained. "Teachers have been buying classroom supplies with their own money." I looked up. "Does Grace?" He nodded. "Nearly every month." I stared through the office windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of people crossed those streets below chasing promotions, contracts, and headlines. Meanwhile, a teacher quietly spent part of her paycheck making sure children had enough crayons and notebooks. That afternoon, one of my charitable foundations, operating under a name that could never be traced back to me, approved an anonymous grant for the school. New books, new computers, a repaired roof before winter. No press release, no photographs, no speeches, only one condition. The principal would be told that an anonymous donor wanted every teacher to receive classroom supplies without spending another dollar of personal income. 3 days later, Daniel handed me a photograph taken from across the street. Grace stood outside the school entrance holding a box of brand new books against her chest. She was laughing, truly laughing. Lily spun circles beside her on the sidewalk, hugging a backpack almost as big as she was. I looked at the picture much longer than I intended. Daniel quietly asked, "Would you like someone to let her know who made the donation?" I carefully folded the photograph and slipped it inside my jacket beside the fragile paper angel. "No," I answered. "Kindness does not become more valuable because someone signs their name to it." Autumn settled over New York almost without anyone noticing. The trees outside Grace's school slowly traded their summer green for shades of amber and gold, and every Friday afternoon the sidewalks filled with children racing toward the people waiting to take them home. One Friday, I found myself parked half a block away inside a black sedan, watching from behind lightly tinted windows. Not because I distrusted the neighborhood, because somewhere along the way, I had started looking forward to seeing one little girl skip through those school doors with more excitement than I ever admitted to myself. Daniel glanced at me through the rearview mirror, but wisely said nothing. Lily burst out of the building exactly at 3:15, wearing a bright red backpack that bounced with every step. Grace followed a few moments later, balancing a canvas tote overflowing with papers waiting to be graded over the weekend. She looked tired again, not defeated, simply carrying more responsibility than one person should. Lily suddenly stopped walking and pointed toward a small park across the street. Grace smiled before nodding, and together they crossed carefully toward a wooden bench beneath a maple tree whose leaves drifted lazily around them. They shared a peanut butter sandwich cut into 2 uneven halves, laughing every time the wind tried to steal the napkins from the bench. I realized then that happiness rarely arrived wrapped in expensive gifts. Sometimes it looked like one sandwich divided between two people who loved each other. Daniel quietly handed me another envelope. "You asked us to stop looking after the school," he said. "We did. But something else came up." Inside were copies of adoption records that had become publicly accessible through routine legal filings. Grace had adopted Lily after serving as her volunteer reading mentor at a foster care center. The reports described Lily as withdrawn when they first met. She rarely smiled. She barely spoke above a whisper. During story hour, she always chose books about families finding each other again. One note from a social worker caught my attention more than anything else. It read, "Lily began speaking freely after several months with Miss Carter. She says she finally believes someone will always come back for her." I read that sentence 3 times before setting the papers down. "Grace saved her," I said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Looks that way." I looked out the window again. Lily had climbed onto the bench and was pretending the fallen leaves were treasure, while Grace applauded every discovery as though each leaf were made of gold. I thought about the paper angel still resting inside the drawer of my desk, about the memory of my own daughter that had almost disappeared beneath years of silence. Grace had given one abandoned child a future. Lily had unknowingly given one broken man a reason to remember his past without running from it. My phone vibrated softly. It was an invitation to a charity gala I normally attended out of obligation rather than interest. Without thinking, I set it aside. Across the street, Lily suddenly spotted an elderly man struggling to gather groceries that had slipped from a paper bag. Before Grace could say a word, Lily ran over, carefully picking up apples one by one while Grace hurried behind to help. The older gentleman smiled with grateful surprise, and Lily beamed as though helping someone was the most ordinary thing in the world. Grace was not just raising a child. She was raising kindness itself. I watched them until the park slowly emptied beneath the fading afternoon light. As they disappeared down the sidewalk hand in hand, I found myself making a quiet promise that no contract had ever required and no witness would ever hear. Whatever tomorrow brought, I would never allow that little girl to wonder again whether someone would come back for her. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow covered the city in quiet white before sunrise, softening rooftops, sidewalks, and all the sharp edges people usually noticed first. I had almost convinced myself that watching over Grace and Lily from a distance was enough. Then Daniel entered my office carrying a folder he did not immediately place on my desk. That alone told me something was different. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Someone else has been asking questions about them." The warmth that had settled over the room disappeared almost instantly. "Who?" Daniel slid several photographs toward me. None showed anything alarming. A gray sedan parked across from Grace's apartment on 3 different mornings. The same vehicle outside Lily's school twice that week. A man sitting alone inside, pretending to read a newspaper while watching the entrance. "We verified that he is a licensed private investigator," Daniel explained. "We do not know who hired him." I studied the photographs carefully. The investigator never approached Grace or Lily. He only observed, took notes, and drove away. Ordinary behavior for his profession, yet something about the timing unsettled me. Until now, no one had connected my life with theirs. I intended to keep it that way. "Find out who retained him," I said quietly. No confrontation, no intimidation, just answers. Daniel nodded once before leaving the office. 2 days passed before he returned. "The client used a legal firm," he reported. "Everything was routed through paperwork that appears legitimate. We are still tracing the source." I walked to the window overlooking the city. Snow continued drifting between the skyscrapers, making Manhattan appear strangely peaceful. Peace, however, often existed only on the surface. Later that afternoon, I drove past the elementary school without announcing myself. Classes had already ended. Children laughed as they packed snow into uneven little snowmen, while parents waited nearby with scarves wrapped around their faces. Grace stood beside the school steps helping one of her students zip a winter coat. She never seemed to hurry a child, even when the cold reddened her own hands. Lily waited nearby, carefully placing tiny mittens onto a snowman she had built no taller than her knees. Then I noticed it. The gray sedan parked half a block away, the same one from the photographs. The driver remained inside, watching the school entrance through the windshield. There was nothing threatening about his behavior, Yet my instincts refused to ignore him. Grace eventually took Lily's hand, and together they began walking toward the subway station. The sedan started a few moments later, maintaining a careful distance. Daniel looked at me from the driver's seat. Should we intervene? I watched until Grace and Lily safely disappeared into the station surrounded by dozens of commuters. No, I answered after a long silence. Not unless we know why this is happening. That evening another report arrived. The investigator had also requested copies of Lily's adoption records and Grace's employment history. Everything he sought was public information, but together the pattern painted a question neither Daniel nor I could answer. Someone had become interested in two ordinary people who deserved nothing more complicated than peaceful lives. I opened my desk drawer and looked at the folded paper angel resting beside the photograph of Grace and Lily outside the school. For months, I had believed I was quietly protecting them without changing their world. Now I understood something that unsettled me far more than any business negotiation ever had. The moment I allowed myself to care, the possibility that someone else might notice them became a responsibility I could no longer ignore. The answer arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, not through rumors or whispered conversations, but inside a single envelope Daniel placed on my desk without saying a word. I opened it slowly, expecting another surveillance report. Instead, I found copies of legal documents bearing the letterhead of a respected family law firm in Manhattan. Grace Carter had recently been contacted by an attorney representing distant relatives of Lily's biological mother. They were requesting a review of the original adoption records after discovering a small trust that had been established years earlier for Lily's future education. The private investigator had never been searching for me. He had been searching for her. I read every page twice before setting them down. Relief washed over me so suddenly that I laughed under my breath. Months of quiet concern dissolved in a single moment. Daniel finally smiled. It appears the attorney hired the investigator only to confirm identities before releasing the trust. I nodded, but another thought immediately followed. Does Grace know? She has a meeting tomorrow afternoon. The next day, I found myself parked across the street from the same law office, telling myself I was only passing by. Even I did not believe that excuse anymore. Snow drifted lazily between the buildings while people hurried along the sidewalks, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. At exactly 2 o'clock, Grace arrived holding Lily's hand. Lily wore the same yellow boots from the rainy evening when our paths first crossed, although they were slightly scuffed now from months of adventures. Nearly an hour later, they emerged again. Grace's eyes were red, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. She knelt on the sidewalk and hugged Lily so tightly that the little girl burst into laughter. Then Grace whispered something that made Lily clap both hands over her mouth before throwing her arms around her mother again. Daniel quietly lowered the window just enough for us to hear fragments of their conversation carried by the winter breeze. Does that mean college? Lily asked excitedly. Grace nodded, brushing a snowflake from Lily's hair. Yes, sweetheart. It means someone thought about your future long before we ever met. Lily looked up toward the gray winter sky with the innocent seriousness only children possess. Then we should say thank you. Grace smiled gently. Sometimes we never meet the people who help us. We thank them by becoming kind ourselves. Those words settled deep inside me. I watched them disappear into the afternoon crowd, carrying nothing more than hope and a folder filled with papers that promised a brighter future. I thought the story might finally be over. Instead, 3 evenings later, there was a quiet knock on the door of the Italian restaurant where everything had begun. Marco walked toward my usual table wearing a puzzled expression. There is someone asking for you, he said softly. I looked toward the entrance. Grace stood there with Lily beside her, both wrapped in warm winter coats dusted with fresh snow. Lily held something carefully behind her back, while Grace searched the room until our eyes met. There was surprise on her face, followed immediately by recognition. She smiled as though she had just solved a puzzle that had been quietly waiting for months. She walked toward my table with calm, steady steps. When she finally stopped beside me, she looked at the paper angel still resting near my coffee cup exactly where I had kept it every Friday since the night we met. Her smile grew warmer. I think, she said gently, we have been thanking the same stranger all along. Grace carefully placed a small paper gift on the table before taking the seat Lily had claimed months earlier. The restaurant seemed just as warm as it had that rainy evening, But something inside me had changed completely. Marco greeted them like old friends before quietly walking away, instinctively protecting the privacy of a moment he sensed was important. Lily grinned as she slid the gift toward me. Open it. I unfolded the brown paper with slower hands than usual. Inside rested a simple wooden picture frame, obviously handmade by a child. Tiny stars had been painted around the edges in uneven shades of blue and gold. At the center was a photograph taken during the school's winter festival. Grace stood beside Lily while snowflakes drifted through the afternoon light. Written beneath the picture in careful crayon letters were the words, "Every family begins with kindness." I could not speak. Grace noticed my expression and smiled gently. The principal mentioned that an anonymous donor repaired the school, replaced every classroom computer, and made sure no teacher had to buy supplies anymore. She also mentioned that the paperwork was prepared by a foundation whose attorney accidentally left one signature uncovered. She laughed softly. Your first name was impossible to miss. I lowered my eyes, almost embarrassed by the discovery. I never wanted credit. I know, she answered. That is exactly how I knew it was you. Lily leaned forward with complete seriousness. Mommy says good people help even when nobody is watching. I smiled at the little girl whose simple wisdom had quietly rewritten my life. Your mommy is very wise. Grace rested her hands around a warm cup of tea before looking at me with thoughtful eyes. Can I tell you something? I nodded. The night Lily met you, I thought she had interrupted an important businessman. She paused before smiling again. Now I think she interrupted someone who had forgotten that he deserved happiness too. Her words settled into the silence between us. Outside, the snow continued falling over Manhattan, covering the busy streets with the same quiet peace I had once believed no longer existed for people like me. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and carefully removed the folded paper angel that had remained with me every single day since that rainy evening. The edges had softened with time, but the tiny wings were still intact. I placed it beside the handmade picture frame. Lily gasped happily. You kept it. I always will, I answered. It reminded me that hope can arrive without making an appointment. She climbed down from her chair and wrapped her little arms around me without hesitation. Months earlier, I would have frozen, uncertain how to respond. Instead, I hugged her, gently, realizing that strength was not measured by how much pain a person could endure alone, but by how much love they were willing to accept when it finally found them. Grace watched us with tears shining quietly in her eyes, though her smile never faded. As we prepared to leave, Lily reached for one of my hands and Grace naturally took the other so we could step together into the softly falling snow. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was not walking toward another meeting, another negotiation, or another lonely Friday night. I was simply walking beside two people who had reminded me that even the coldest winters eventually surrender to kindness. People often believe power changes the world because it can build skyscrapers, shape markets, or command attention. They are wrong. The world changes when one small child notices an empty chair, asks a simple question, and teaches a lonely heart that the greatest family is sometimes the one compassion quietly creates.